Today I'd like to take a look at the Buddhist conception in terms of developing mental immunity. When you think about it, mental immunity is really learning to develop the destructive emotions, to avoid those, to develop a pattern where we can avoid destructive emotions and really to develop more positive ones. So we have this battle. We have some destructive emotions within us that can get the better of us and that can rise to the fore and take us to places maybe we don't want to go to. And then we have the positive emotions that sometimes we suppress. And so how can we develop more positive emotions and learn in some way to avoid those destructive emotions? And that would be the Buddhist concept of mental immunity. So to develop the mind to that point. How do we do that? You might say, that's great. I'd love to do that, but how do I do that? Some possible ways to develop that in terms of the Buddhist tradition. One, through self-inquiry, through looking inside oneself and looking at certain patterns in our lives. Then also through the idea of meditation. And through meditation, we can really discover more about ourselves and about our relationships with other people. We can also discover the nature of our mind, and look at how our mind works in different situations, and to soothe our emotional reactivity. So we know when we're going to have certain emotions in certain situations, and we can learn to soothe those emotions, to deal with them, to kind of calm them down. Now, how would that relate to a Christian understanding of mind? Well, certainly we speak about the importance in our Christian faith of meditation and of finding an interior peace, an interior calm. We see it in the ministry of Jesus. We see Jesus withdrawing to quiet places. And in those quiet places, he's able to pray, to meditate, so that those emotions, those human emotions, which Jesus certainly experienced, Jesus could control those emotions. And certainly he was in many situations where those emotions would have come to the fore. So we see a parallel here between the Christian concept of meditation and this Buddhist idea of developing a mental immunity. The first step in terms of developing this mental immunity is to accept the reality of suffering. In the Buddhist conception, this is a key moment, this moment of suffering, and accepting that in the world there is going to be suffering. You will encounter suffering. Buddha says, I have taught one thing and one thing only, and that is suffering and the cessation of suffering. So what Buddha wanted to deal with, most importantly, in his life and in his teaching and in his practice, was to overcome suffering. To overcome suffering through our attitude towards it. And again, parallel with our Christian faith, how do we overcome suffering? We overcome suffering as Jesus overcame it, by not turning away from it, but realizing what it is and walking through that suffering with faith, with confidence, with love. We will all have to face either mental suffering, physical suffering, emotional suffering. There will be suffering in our lives. But in terms of dealing with suffering, it is our attitude towards suffering that is key both in the Buddhist and in the Christian understanding. The Sanskrit word for suffering that Buddha uses is dukkha. And dukkha can be translated in several ways, not just suffering. We translate it as a stress, as anxiety, as suffering, as dissatisfaction. And you see the relationship between these. Stress, one of the movements today that we see in our world is the idea of stress reduction and the importance of recognizing stress and taking steps to cope with our stress. Stress can lead to a lot of physical symptoms that can be destructive and harmful for us. So certainly dealing with stress, dealing with these anxieties that we face are very important. And so in the Buddhist tradition, we have to recognize the reality that we are going to face these stresses. We are going to face these anxieties, these sufferings, and we have to deal with them. Trying to control what cannot be controlled can lead to frustration and to anger. It's important that we recognize what we can control and what we can't control. There are some situations that are beyond our control where no matter what we do, we're not going to affect the outcome. You have to realize that, and there's a letting go of that is important. For example, we cannot end natural disasters or the suffering that they cause. We can try, of course, to cope with them. We can try to develop strategies to deal with them, and we can assist people who are going through natural disasters. But so much of the rest of our suffering we can control. And even when it comes to natural disasters, so much of our response is reaching out as human beings to one another and helping one another, giving relief to one another. Extremely important. The concept that the Buddhists would speak about in terms of dealing with suffering is sukha. So we have, on the one hand, we have the idea of the suffering that we experience, the dukkha. Then we have the sukha, the happiness, ease, or comfort. So it's naturally this battle between the two. How can we achieve happiness in the midst of suffering? And the Aryan basis for it, the word that is the basis, is very interesting. It means having a bad axle. So if you're, got a cart going and, the axle is bad, you're not going to get too far with that. You have to repair the axle. The axle is key. So the basis for this is, well, we've got to have that axle in working order. It's got to be good. It's going to get us through. And it's going to help us to transport our food, to transport whatever we need if we have that axle in the right situation. And the importance really of dealing with our mind. And this is something we're going to explore in terms of meditation and how to deal with the mental aspects of suffering and to overcome that.